Okay, Paul DeBarth is with us, but he has limited internet and a lot of things going on. So he asked if I would introduce Phil. Phil Andrus grew up in Cedar City in Provo, Utah. He married Regina Peck 52 years ago. Four children, eight grandchildren, and four great grandchildren. His career was with the Air Force as an officer. His education was BYU, University of Missouri Columbia, and National Defense University. He has served missions in Delaware, Maryland, and 3 in Russia. He works as a real estate agent for Century 21 and attends church at Cameron, Missouri. He will address us on the Hebrewisms in the Book of Mormon this evening. Deb will offer the opening prayer.
Robert, I'm going to mute you for just a second and see if that helps me to hear. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay, let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather tonight. And Lord, we know that there are several folks who are under severe weather alerts. And we would just ask for your spirit of safety to be with them, that no one will come to any harm because of this weather. And as we share together in Phil's presentation, may we do so respectfully and with our minds and our hearts open to the perspectives that he will share. Be with all those who are traveling, and we thank you for Brother Paul being able to make it with us tonight. Be with those who are not here for various reasons. We remember Monty and Bill, and all those who are normally part of our family who might not be here tonight. We thank you, Lord, for this opportunity once again. In the name of your Son, Jesus, amen. For whatever reason, Robert, that helps completely.
Really interesting. So Phil, take it away. I'll mute myself.
Phil, you will need to unmute. Hopefully you know how to do that.
And Phil, please clarify if you would like to have people wait for questions and comments till after your presentation, or if you would prefer to be interrupted with those questions as they come up.
So let me ask him to unmute. Oh, there you
How
are.
about now?
Now you can. Yep.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. In answer to your question, Paul, I don't know, it probably easier. I kind of hate to see people hold on to comments because then they forget them and, they might be very meaningful, but we'll just play it by ear, if you really want to jump in and say something, then please jump in and say something. And I will preface this by saying, no matter what presentation I ever give, I usually manage to offend somebody. I don't want to do that. But if I say something stupid, just say, well, he already warned us he was going to say something stupid, so I'll just forget that. So I use this quote from Ecclesiastes because I like that. There's no new thing under the sun. The ideas I'm going to present to you tonight are not new. At least, I'm borrowing from other people. Notably to some of these people, John Welch on down to even Google, I borrowed a lot. I am not an academician. I like to read, but I would not consider myself a great intellect, okay? So if you're looking for a great intellect tonight, you're going to have to look somewhere else. Just so bear with me on that. But I borrowed heavily from all these folks and tried to weave it into something that is comprehensible and useful. And of course, what I want to talk about is evidence of Hebrew style in the Book of Mormon, specifically Chiasmus and Alma 13. I'll let you digest this slide for a minute. The Alma 13 it's got shorter chiasms in it. It's got a long chiasm, and it goes from, in the LDS version of the Book of Mormon, it's Alma 13, 2 through 9, just those few scriptures. Now, I recognize there are other versions of the Book of Mormon. The words are the same, but some of the breaks on the verses are a little different. They're not too far off, and in a couple of places I'll show that, but mostly I'm throwing you to the wolves if you don't have an LDS version of the Book of Mormon. But I think you'll be able to follow it. But there are the four shorter chiasms. It uses other things such as synonymia, cyclodes, and repetition. And what I want to do is say, why Alma 13? Why did I pick Alma 13? Because there's all sorts of chiasms in the Book of Mormon. This is not a complete list by any means. There's just some of the more notable ones. So why Alma 13? Well, because I kind of discovered this particular chiasm on myself. And I was just reading it and I thought, this really fits. And then after I went through it all, and then I thought, well, I better look and see how many other people discovered it before me. And sure enough, there were many, and they'd written a lot of information on it. And so, but it was still meaningful to me because, you kind of, when you search the scriptures and you find something that strikes you, then, it's more meaningful. And also because the core message is entering into God's rest. And I'm sure you all feel the same way I do. That's what it's all about. That's what I want to ultimately be able to do. I have a twofold purpose. First is to show the complexity and the structure in this, and it's just another witness that the Book of Mormon is not something that Joseph Smith came up with. Simply couldn't. And then also to understand what Alma was trying to teach in these particular verses. So first of all, and I hope I don't offend anybody by giving you a definition of chiasmus, but if there's anyone out there who maybe doesn't know what it is, it comes from a classical Greek verb which I cannot pronounce. You can see it written up there, but it means crossing two lines with an X. It's a parallelism, and it's a rhetorical device. It's been around for 3,000 years. It even showed up in the Ugaritic texts, and you can see down there at the bottom, those are cuneiform. There's some real problems with some of the words here. Cuneiform writings in the 13th and 12th centuries BC and even earlier. So, even though it has been around for a long time, it's largely unnoticed or overlooked in the Bible until about 150, 180 years ago. The first one was to take notice of it and publish on it was Robert Loth in 1787. Now, I've heard some people who have been opponents of the Book of Mormon say, well, see, Joseph Smith it was available in 1787. He could have gotten it and used it. Well, the only problem with that 1787 version, it wasn't translated out of Latin until 1829. So Joseph Smith didn't speak Latin and read it. So kind of shoots that theory down. The other thing is these three authors they noticed chiasmus, but mostly they focused on the poetical imagery and the parallelisms, not real chiasmus per se. We'd say two lines of poetry are said to be parallel if the components of one line correspond to the other code in a one-to-one relationship. Now, John Jebb did notice the chiasmus, and he called it epinotos. And but again, that work was not available. I mean, he didn't write on it until 1820, so it's not likely that it was very extant in rural New York at that time. Just a couple of quick examples of direct parallelisms in the Bible. And you see the first one there, that's just a direct. And then you get the second, it becomes inverted, then it becomes a chiasmus. My thoughts are your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. And even New Testament. Now, the thing is, in 1830, in Western New York, all of the university museums that were available to Joseph Smith in Western New York, they weren't there. So if chiasmus can be convincingly identified in the Book of Mormon through these Hebraic forms, it's just another witness that Joseph Smith was all that he said he was, a translator and not the writer. Because no one in New York in the 1829 understood chiasmus. And the more extant or the more detailed works weren't published until Joseph had been, 10 years after his martyrdom. Even today's scholars don't know a whole lot about chiasmus. There's kind of a subgroup now that champions it because of their familiarity with the Book of Mormon. But even if, and that's the other thing I wanted to point out. In looking for chiasmus in the Bible, a lot of times it has been covered over by the translations. So you would have to go back to, earlier texts to discover the chiasmus. So that's another reason why, Joseph Smith didn't notice it or wouldn't have noticed it. And then let's say that Joseph Smith did notice chiasmus. He figured out, okay, my thoughts are not your thoughts, your thoughts are, and he said, okay, I see this form. Well, now he would have to take it and he would have to create the message and format the message into chiasmus, which is a new level of complexity. It's not just the fact that it's written in a chiastic form, it's that it has a message. And I'm sure you've heard these words of Emma Smith referring to the entire Book of Mormon, but they also apply here. It would have been improbable for a learned man to do this, and one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. So if chiasmus is in the Book of Mormon, it didn't get put there by Joseph Smith or any of his associates at that time. They just didn't know about it. Now let's take a little closer look at chiasmus, what it is. Chiasmus is, as I said, an inverted parallelism. You start off with idea A, progress to B, C, then and multiples. You can have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you back out. And at the middle of the chiasmus is the turning point. Sometimes it's repeated, sometimes it's just stated in one line. But that's what the author of the chiasmus is building towards. He's trying to get this central point across to you by going into it and then backing out. It gives a greater emphasis on it. It lets you know, okay, this is what I'm out to show you. This is what I'm out to teach you. Chiasmus is not limited to the Book of Mormon and the Bible. You even have it in the Kichimaya text. And this is from the Popol Vuh. And you can see that it's a pretty good chiasmus. I mean, you start with the A, you end with the A, and you get to the center, and The message is all is at rest, nothing stirs. By the way, if I'm flipping through these slides too fast, please stop me and say, hey, I didn't get to read that. We also have chiasmus in the Quran. And this is from the Throne Surah, Al-Baqarah. And again, it's a really good one. Very clear. Now, as Alma worked on this chiastic passages, he also had other rhetorical devices that he threw in there as well. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these because I kind of wanted to focus on chiasmus, but just I wanted to mention them, where you had the use of multiple synonyms to amplify or give more detail on a term. And you have an example there, and I will reject, hardness, blindness. Those are complementary terms. Hardness of heart in Hebrew and Nephite idiom. It doesn't mean exactly what it says, but it has symbolic significance. And then you have things like grace, equity, and truth. They're not identical, but they're used in a complementary manner. So this is, use of synonyms. Cycloids. This is a mathematical term, which just, it's a circular or cyclical fashion. And this is, example of this is in Alma 13, 7 through 9. And I will come back to this because there's something significant about this that I wanted to point out. But, without beginning of days or years, beginning or end, beginning of days or end. Again, that's a good example of a cycloid. And then repetition. There's a lot of repetition in these verses that we're focusing on tonight. Here's one of the points where I tried to include the verses of the RE version of the Book of Mormon as opposed to just the LDS version. So you can see that there's, in traditional English, we frown on too much repetition. We want to streamline it, but of course, Hebrew writing, they kind of thrive on the repetition to emphasize the point. So why did Alma use chiasmus in his sermon? Well, he was teaching a tough crowd. It's full of corrupt lawyers, so-called intellectuals, and he wanted to get this message across. He wanted to talk about the priesthood, the eternal nature of God, and of course, the Lord's rest. So his words had to be spiritual, but they had to have an impact. They had to capture the audience. And this is what the main chiasm in Alma 13 looks like. You start off with the A1, A prime down there, the order of the sun, ordained, called and called, working on down to the center point, which is his rest. That's the focus. Interestingly enough, there are 4 short chiasms within the main chiasm. The first is he's talking about the priests that were ordained and the way in which they were ordained that the people might know. And again, Alma 13:3, where they were ordained because they had shown exceedingly great faith and had chosen good works. And the next 2 go on to verses 3 through 4 and 4 through 5. They're called with a holy calling, and in a way such that people would know. And I'll explain this a little bit more. I'll try to show it out a little bit more. But the 4th short was just, pointing out that all of these priests were selected and chosen because of their great faith, and that blessing was available to everybody had they taken advantage of it. You know, most of God's blessings are available to anybody who will take them. Then he sets a foundation. He starts off the very first beginning of Alma 13. He says, I want you to remember that God ordained priests after his holy order, and then after the order of his son, to teach these things. They were authorized to teach these things to people. Now, you know, Alma and Amulek were examples of these ordained priests. And they chose God, they were redeemed, and then they were called in a manner that the people would recognize that they had the authority to teach. And they got that authority through their obedience. Also, he's setting the foundation about the eternal nature of God. Again, this is your cycloidal. It's repeated 3 times. And the one thing I want to point out is each time that he uses these verses 7, 8, and 9, it changes a little bit, and it accentuates the eternal nature of both Christ and the priesthood. And the first 2 uses, it's the higher priesthood being the priesthood after the order of the Son, which is also eternal. And the second time teaches the eternal nature of God, of the Son, and of the priesthood. The last time the phrase is used, it's the Lord Jesus Christ who is eternal, or without beginning or end. So his priesthood, and then him. He is eternal. Again, the main chiasm, just so you take a look at it again. You see how these, in the beginning, you see the 4 shorter chiasms, how they play into it, showing how that these priests were ordained, how they were given authorization, ordained, and then the importance of the priesthood and having, you know, the priesthood of the Saviors of the Lord leading us to be eligible to obtain his rest. Now, what is the Lord's rest? Again, the main point of the whole chiasm was his rest. It's the turning point. It's other places it's referred to as my rest, the rest of God, the rest of the Lord. It's defined in Doctrine and Covenants 84:24, and I'm just going to read this, but it's also 83:4b in the Community of Christ scriptures, as the fullness of his glory, by which we may infer the people who enter into the rest of God are able to live in the presence of God in the fullness of his glory. And then quoting from the Doctrine and Covenants, and without the ordinances thereof and the authority of the priesthood, the power of godliness is not manifest unto men in the flesh. There's that authority of the priesthood. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. Now this Moses plainly taught to the children of Israel in the wilderness, and sought diligently to sanctify his people, that they might behold the face of God. But they hardened their hearts and could not endure his presence. Therefore the Lord in his wrath, for his anger was kindled against them, swore that they should not enter into his rest while in the wilderness, which rest is a fullness of his glory. Again, that's kind of what I'm looking for. You know, I want to enter in and be worthy to be there. Alma taught that entering into God's rest was seeing the Lord face to face, and it could only be accomplished through the power of the higher priesthood. To emphasize that the rest of God was the center point of this priesthood, Alma used the term rest 4 times before the sermon and 4 times in the concluding portions of the sermon. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, it's likely that Alma was really had a prepared text, because if you remember, he was talking to the one person who was critiquing him, and he said, well, you know, this is just about what I was going to say. I think it's Alma 12:26. He says, I was just about to get into that, and then he launches into this discussion, this chiastic discussion, at which rest is the center. So I think Alma had prepared his comments ahead of time. So, I'm already at the conclusion. It's a complex and significant literary and doctrinal passage. It teaches the tenets of priesthood and its connection to the atonement, to the pre-mortal life, and to faith and obedience. It teaches the doctrine of preparatory redemption, and it marks the path that we as disciples must take to enter the rest of God. It's got important doctrinal teaches in a relatively short, just basically 9 verses, but it uses literary beauty and complexity. This is not something that the prophet Joseph Smith, at that point in his life, was capable of making up. And this is just one example of many in the Book of Mormon of chiastic passages and chiastic sermons. The chapter of Alma 36, where Alma is speaking to his son, the whole chapter is chiastic in its structure. So getting back to Alma 13, these passages, they afford the hope and comfort that all faithful saints who have been valiant in the service of God and kept his commandments and loved our fellow beings, we can look forward to the rest of God. And then Enos, who lived a good life, who had done what he should, he says, and I soon go to the place of my rest, which is with my Redeemer, for I know in him I shall rest. And I rejoice in the day when my mortal shall put on immortality, and shall stand before him when I shall see his face with pleasure. And he will say unto me, come unto me, ye blessed. There is a place prepared for you in the mansions of my Father. And for those of you who would like to understand it a little bit better, I've included many of the resources that I used in putting these slides together. So, thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't give you a drink out of a fire hydrant, but maybe I did. So I try to answer any questions you might have.
Bill, I get to intrude here as the regular host, and I want to say thank you for your preparation for taking on this rather challenging task. I would like for you to go back to the God's rest element, because I have a question hiding in there, and your rather clear explanation bypassed my thinking, and so your explanation of what God's rest means is something I would appreciate if you review, since that was, after all, a pivotal point of the chiasm.
Yeah. Okay. Is this particular slide you're talking about?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, that was the one I quoted from when I was reading, when I was originally going through this, when I noticed, okay, this links to the Doctrine and Covenants. And so I jumped over to there, and that gave me a definition of what rest was. And so, to Alma, he's saying, I want you to, do these things and you can enter into his rest. And I'm saying, okay, well, what's rest? Well, if I go to the Doctrine and Covenants, I learn that it is the fullness of his glory, which to me says, you're with God. And I can't think of, nothing any better than that.
Okay, well, to me, that raises a question, because most of us, I think of rest as a time to go to sleep. Yeah, I like it when I can be doing something that I think is productive, and resting is rarely that. But
Mhm.
I really do appreciate the concept of the fullness of his glory, because to me, when you start looking at the awesome nature of the universe, with multiple galaxies, hundreds and thousands of galaxies beyond the Milky Way, which is much greater than our ability to perceive by itself, or for that matter, even a little bit of Earth. is greater than what we're able to perceive. To appreciate the fullness of the glory of God that is beyond time and beyond space is so multidimensional.
And to me,
Rest,
that
rest
represents
doesn't strike me
rest.
as being a very good word for describing it.
Yeah. And I, you know, classically we do think about rest, taking a nap, you know, I'm going to have a rest. And certainly there is that. But to me, when I read these scriptures, I see rest as so much more as, you know, maybe rest from the burdens of mortality, rest, you know, just, I don't know, just a freedom. You know, if you're in the fullness of his glory, to me, that's okay. Yeah, all the fatigues and everything are erased. So
It appears to me that Christianity tends to focus pretty heavily upon sin and saving people from their sins. Salvation gets to be a major focus of most of Christianity. For us to be beyond that sin may very well be a rest that could be implied here. But it seems to me that the gospel really is encouraging us beyond salvation to participate in Zion, which is a place of righteousness, hope, and peace. A place where we need to learn new language, probably, if we're going to be able to participate effectively there.
I agree with you. I mean, it's just kind of, I think he's not looking for, I think your Father in heaven wants more than just blind obedience. He wants sons and daughters who do what is right because that's what they want to do, and not because they're commanded, not that they're constrained to be obedient, but because they wouldn't act any other way. It's like, you know, it speaks in the Book of Mormon of the converted Lamanites when, you know, I have no more disposition to do evil because they were converted. And that, you know, I think we all need to get to that point where we're moving forward and we're participating in becoming more like our Heavenly Father because of love, not because of a threat of punishment.
If you would,
And
please, Phil, take us back to the first slide,
first slide, okay.
if you would, please, because
There's
you,
probably a way to do this faster, but I'll just go back. I know this is going to work.
whoop, nope, next slide.
Next slide. Next slide.
Yes, but I thought, there you are, Sinomia. You didn't talk about that one, and I think that may very well be an unfamiliar word for someone meriting some explanation.
Yeah, well, I called it. I use the word Sonoma. I just have a hard time getting my tongue around that. But let's
That's a
jump
good
up
reason
to
to
it.
avoid it, huh?
Yeah, it is a supporting rhetorical device that he uses, and you know, it is everything a repetition of the terms that bang out the same message. Hardness of their hearts, rejecting the spirit, blindness of their minds. You know, it's the same message there.
Yeah.
You know, if I say hardness of heart or blindness of mind, you know, you get the same message.
Yeah, but thank you for illustrating that one and highlighting it because I think that's a useful one to have in our vocabulary as well. And let's
Yeah.
open to the questions and comments from other people. Please, if you go to your React page, a React symbol at the bottom of the screen, you can raise your hand and get on the queue that way, or wave your hand and Deb will get you in the lineup and take whatever question or comments you have.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Blair, good evening. Your turn is next.
Good evening. You hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Chiasms. They are throughout the Bible. They are throughout the Book of Mormon. And as you noted, they're in the Quran and other places. That's because we humans organize our thoughts. When we write them in an organized way, and we're totally unaware that we are doing it. This is my perspective. I'll give you a little reason for that. But it's 25 or more years since I first heard of chiasms and how they worked, and I was awestruck by them. And I started going into chiasms that were in our scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants. And section 162 was given by Grant McMurray at a conference that I attended. I was struck by the word listen. That is what I call the listen chiasm, or the listen revelation. Listen, listen, listen. If you take just those words, listen, and the phraseology on either side of it, it forms this chiasm, and it ends in the middle and goes out, spreads out in a beautiful fashion. I made a copy of 6 chiasms in that revelation before that revelation went before the conference. I handed a copy of it to Grant McMurray that day, and I asked him if he knew that he wrote in chiasms. And he told me no. But he did. He was totally unaware of what he had been doing. After that conference, I came home and continued studying that one Revelation 162. And I had found at the end 25 different chiasms. And they were arranged so that if you took the phraseology on each side of these things that repeat, they gave a message. They give a message. If the one that's before us now says, the order of the sun is ordained by the foreknowledge of God. And then at the bottom, if you look at that and read it backwards, the order of the sun is ordained and called by the foreknowledge of all things. It's automatic. We think that way. We organize our thoughts that way when we write. And I checked into 6 different books, secular books, one of which was a German translation by Albrecht Speer, who was a Nazi bigwig tried in the Nuremberg trials. And he wrote a book about his experience with Hitler. And in that book, I found chiasms. Wherever I looked, I found chiasms. Chiasms are not Hebraic. They are ubiquitous and common to all human writing of any system, in my opinion. And to think that it's done intentionally is quite misleading, because I can take, I believe, any well-written paragraph of 500 words or page of 500 words in a certain subject, any subject, and find chiasms in it.
I've written a lot. I've had as an Air Force officer, I had to do a lot of writing, a lot of briefing senior officers. And oftentimes we would give briefings where we would start out and say, okay, tell them what you give the briefing and then tell them what you said. And that's kind of like a chiastic structure. But when it came to writing, we were taught, and I've been, in my university studies, I've not been taught to write chiastically. If I write chiastically in a professional paper, then it comes back all marked to pieces and saying, you're wasting you're repetitive and we don't teach, we don't recognize it. Now you say that it comes about naturally. To some degree, I can accept that, but not to the degree that Joseph Smith translated in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, they're very clear. They're clearer than in the New Testament because of the word changes and the translations. And then on top of that, I think Joseph Smith is a highly intelligent person. But I think if you're going to really write and create something such as this, it's going to take a lot more effort than just, a stream of consciousness as you're dictating to Oliver Cowdery. And that didn't happen. I mean, they translated the Book of Mormon in such a short period of time. There's no way that they could have constructed chiasms with any meaningful way, because these are meaningful chiasms. They're not just
meaningful.
They're not just accidental.
They are meaningful. They run through the scriptures. They are very meaningful, but they are not intentionally done. You don't sit down and try to write something chiastically. I can't do it by thought and trying to make things together. But if I sit down and write a paper, I was in the work for the Army, had all of this training, don't talk and speak in the passive form, and I'm very familiar with the arguments there. But brother, it doesn't happen because you try to do it. You just do it. Everybody.
Well, I guess at this point I will say we will have to agree to disagree.
Okay, brother. But this does not mean that the chiasms are not meaningful. What I'm saying, they are to me a wonderful testimony of the intelligence of God, because the glory of God is intelligence. And I see chiastic structures as being the result of the organization of the human mind in putting the lines of words on a piece of paper. And it comes automatically.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. We got quite a few in the queue, so we'll start with Ron and then we'll go to Keith. Go ahead, please, Ron Smith.
Yeah, I appreciate very much what you've put together here on this, and I recognize the extent of the chiasms, and that's quite a thing. I also can identify with the excitement of finding your own chiasm in the Book of Mormon. The first
Yeah,
one
but it wasn't original by any means.
Right. The first one I found, I had an experience kind of like yours. I was reading one of King Benjamin's discourses, and right at the end, I discovered the chiasm. Well, lots of people have written about it before, but I had never seen it, and it was exciting to see. So so I tried to write a program to look for chiasms, to search for chiasms. From you just input the text and come up with it, and I was not very successful. The uh, because there is a sense of having to decide what to leave out and what to keep in, and because you're talking about an idea or a phrase that that repeats, but you have lots of words that repeat, whether they're in the phrase or not. There's lots of thes every place and lots of other things. But did you ever try anything like that? That's my question. It's kind of a nerdy one. Did you ever try to uh, use computer or anything to search for them, or do you just do it by looking at them and searching, finding the middle and working your way back out?
Well, to some degree, I guess I got lazy because, I found several of them and I thought, man, this is really great. But then rather than, again, I want to see what other people have done. And there was so much written out there that just kind of occupied me and just kind of reading one after another thing. And so I didn't get to writing my own program to do that. Of course, I wouldn't have the smarts to do that anyway. The last programming I did was in COBOL and Fortran. So,
I understand.
actually, I relied heavily on the scholarship of others, different
Yeah.
views, but other scholarships,
Okay.
which is
Well, thank you.
I tried to explain that at the beginning too, because I'm uh, not an academician by any means. I'm just a reader, a studier.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, Keith, and then Terry. Go ahead, Keith.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation, Phil. Um, I wanted to point out that there's a lot of other Hebrew Hebraisms in the Bible, as that the Book of Mormon also reflects. Um, just the phrase "and it came to pass" is one of the phrases that comes to mind off the top of my head. But there's a lot of different things that they do like that. But I wanted to also ask you about what it means to come into God's rest. Most of us think about death and passing into paradise and entering into God's rest that way. I'm wondering if it could also mean entering into peace by accepting the gospel of Christ. So if you could comment on that for a moment, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
That entering into the peace by accepting gospel of Christ is absolutely fundamental. I mean, that is the direction your life changes. When you can be on that track, then I think ultimately you will be in the Father's presence. My concept of death is, death, you enter into a spirit world where, there's still work being done there. People are still learning and growing. I do not believe that we are in the presence of the Father at that point. I believe that comes later at the resurrection. And at that point, if we are worthy, if we have truly accepted Christ and become changed so that we are like him, then at that point, I think we enter into the Father's presence. So we're and everything he has, he gives to us. We become his true sons and daughters.
Yeah, I agree with that. Especially the point about not being in the Father's presence in paradise. But I do believe that Christ's presence will be in paradise. Remember, he told the thief on the cross, "This day you'll be with me in paradise, with me, Christ." And so I firmly believe that paradise,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, paradise will be
Okay.
with Christ.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I certainly wouldn't deny it, and it would be, and certainly things you say and point out would indicate that it's there. I don't know. Hopefully, and
Yeah,
hopefully, I mean, I believe there are different locations after this life. I mean, you'd be with me in paradise, but that implies that you could have been somewhere else other than paradise.
yeah.
And
And I like your pointing out that there's still work going on in paradise. Um, After my father-in-law passed away, he came back to my daughter, and she was very young at the time. I think children have an ability to see angels and spiritual beings better than we do as adults. We quit believing that we can see them at that point. But he came back to her, and they laughed and played and had a great time together for several minutes. And then he said, "I have to go. The babies are crying, and I'm taking care of them." And so, and there was another instance where my aunt, who had committed suicide, and she came in response to my grandfather's fervent prayers about whether or not suicides would go to hell. And she came to him and told him, and this he wasn't even asleep at the time, but she told him that she was fine, she was happy, she was in Christ, with Christ in paradise. And so uh, there may be some exceptions to that rule, but not for her. But yeah, I think everyone has a job. Everyone has a purpose when they go to paradise, and they're giving opportunities to learn about Christ if they didn't know. And there was one instance where a lady was very concerned about her husband who had never been baptized, and he passed away and went to heaven, and she was praying very much about whether or not she needed to do the sacrament of baptism for the dead. And she was told by him, "No, don't worry about it. I've been baptized here." So he was given the opportunity to learn about and accept Christ in paradise and be baptized there. And so I think there's still a lot going on there that we will have an opportunity to share in when we get there.
Thank you, Keith. Terry and then Val. Go ahead, Terry.
When I was in college, I took two writing classes, one of them specifically for writing archaeological reports, etc. And neither one of those teachers mentioned the word chiasm, but that's how they taught us to write is it with a chiasm. Because if you're doing a paper, for example, if it's only a page long, you tell them what you're going to say it, and then you tell them what you just said. And that's what a chiasm does. And so I think whatever deity helped Joseph transcribe that knew that. That's why it's the way it is.
yeah, and there's a complexity in these chiasms that it took some thought to what's my message. Rest is the center point. Okay, I got to get to that. To me, it's there's a level of complexity. that Joseph Smith didn't have at that stage in his life.
Okay. Val, go ahead, and then Boyd.
Just in response to something I think Keith said, the things like "and it came to pass" they're part of what made Mark Twain's call the Book of Mormon chloroform in print. But if you're reading in Hebrew, it doesn't have any vowels. It has all the words run together. There's no spaces.
Yeah, no punctuation.
Yeah, no punctuation at all. And so things like "and it came to pass" are really helpful to be able to spot the beginning of a new sentence. There's a lot of, you essentially have to have verbal punctuation instead of the punctuation marks we use. So if you wrote that same thing in Hebrew, some of that stuff that seems tiresome and repetitive becomes extremely helpful. But that's just a comment. My question is, so seems like there has to be some kind of theory about translation built into this, because if you look at languages like German, always puts the verbs at the end of a word. I sometimes split them, but you have all the verbs piling up and then coming out at the end of the sentence. So word order is something that varies from language to language. And to some extent, in the longer chiasms, if you have a chiasm that is a whole sentence and you're just picking out one word in the sentence, that kind of thing might pass through even a relatively non-literal translation. But if you want to preserve things like chiasm, which require word order in translation, and as you said, some of them get lost as they went from the Hebrew translation into the English before they were aware of the chiasm and trying to preserve it. So what are the implications of this for the way the translation happened? Because there's two broad theories. One is tight translation, where Joseph was just kind of reading something and it was translated in the heavens. And then there's the looser translation where he just gets the gist of what it is and then puts it into his own language. It would be harder to carry those through if he's putting the sentences together himself and not consciously aware of the chiasms. They might get lost in just the different word order of English and Reformed Egyptian. So anyway, do you have any thoughts on what this means for what the nature of the translation was?
I think given Joseph's educational level at that time, he pretty much had to see, and because there were times when he would spell words out to Oliver when Oliver was translating. And Oliver would translate a word and he spell it, and Joseph would say, "No, that's not right. It needs to be," and he would spell it out. And Joseph's level of education at that point was not up to that standard. And like in Emma's words again, he couldn't have done it. And so I personally believe that he saw the script that he was supposed to read to Oliver. How that works, I don't know. I've heard, anecdotal accounts, or I think they're true accounts, but one of the servant girls working around the place where Joseph and Oliver were translating, they came out of the room and their faces were both shining, and she just, what's going on in that room? I think there was something going on that we're not experienced with. And for that to happen.
If that's the way the translation happened, that would certainly preserve chiasms, because it would mean some pretty heavy heavenly processing of the words before they got to Joseph, and that would preserve these kinds of structures in ways that a looser approach wouldn't.
Alma, in this particular case, Alma, Mosiah, others who wrote chiastic passages, they wrote it and they put the thought into creating the language. They put the the chiasms together. They put the other Hebraisms we see are their words, but I think that through the translation process, Joseph was able to see their words that they wrote, to understand their words. I mean, they were writing in, figures and that, not, ABC, but that was, I think there was a translation process where he saw what they wrote and he repeated it to Oliver and Oliver wrote it down. That's
Well,
how I feel.
he didn't see what they wrote, or we'd have a Reformed Egyptian text and not an
Well,
English text.
I mean, he saw what the meaning of what they wrote, the words that, the translation was made from Reformed Egyptian to English for him to read. And, again, we don't know a lot about that process.
That's true. There's a sort of famous saying, poetry is lost. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. And that's because if you have something like any kind of well-crafted poem, a Shakespeare sonnet or something, it becomes virtually impossible to put that into another language and preserve that what they do with sound, preserve what they do with images a lot of times because of the idioms and everything. So a lot gets lost when you do translation. Now, I do think that the Hebrew poetry, which has to do with these parallelisms, it'll get lost a little bit less than some of the things that are part of our poetic tradition. But you still could lose it because of the word order problems. However, if there's a bunch of people in heaven doing the translation and just feeding it to Joseph, they could certainly preserve a lot of the structure.
Yeah, somehow, however it worked, I think the structure was preserved. My less than humble opinion.
Okay. Boyd, it's your turn. Go ahead. Make sure you unmute.
Hey, Phil. Good presentation.
Thank you.
I have a experience to tell you, and then I tell you, I have a question too on top of this. I had a similar experience with like Blair had, but some years ago, it must have been 20 years ago or so, I was online, and there was an interesting conversation going back and forth about chiasmus. And so you got one group of people were saying, well, chiasmus is unique to Hebrew. And then you got another group that say, no, it's goes beyond Hebrew. You find it everywhere else. So they were pulling out Shakespeare. They're bringing up all kind of stories and showing all these examples of chiasmus you see everywhere else. And so the one side was just, they're divisive. They're arguing back and forth. And one guy was absolutely insisting that it was only in Hebrew. And then another fella commented back, and it was so funny to me, is he took this guy's comment. It was all typed, of course. And he pulled a chiasmus out of this guy who was arguing that the chiasmus is only in Hebrew. And this guy is in English, and he pulled out a chiasmus out of his own comment. And that ended the whole conversation there and the whole thing. So he was able to prove to him that it's not just Hebrew, it's across various languages. Now, Bob was making a point here, touch something I was thinking about. Without question, there's a lot of chiasmus in the scriptures, and the Book of Mormon's full of it. But I wonder if there's more that we're not seeing, because you see, like what you have here on the screen in front of us, you got order of his son, and then you got the same words, in verse 9 at the bottom. And so they're using the same words, but if you're looking at concepts, I wonder if you have more chiasms in there because you got meanings instead of just the same words. You got actually, the words that says something similar, but that's not the same words, and which would make it more challenging for when Ron was trying to put together a program. If he's looking for chiasmus, it's one thing to find the same words. It's a whole other thing to find concepts that are similar, but they're not using the same words. I don't know. Wait, what do you think on it?
Well, you'd have you have these short chiasms within the main chiasm, And
Mhm.
it's very easy to even as you're going through it to miss those. I wish I could remember this. I there was a person who was they were translating from the Book of Mormon from English to Hebrew. And anyway, they were saying, we're having a problem with this. Do you want us to translate from English into Hebrew, or do you want us to translate from Hebrew to Hebrew? Because this Book of Mormon is Hebraic in its structure and form. Do you want us to convert it to English before we convert it back to Hebrew, or do you just want us to take it from the Hebrew form and go straight to Hebrew? And I probably messed that up a little bit because I've been trying to lock in on it, and I can't quite handle it, can't quite grab it. But that was the gist of it. You've got a book here that's Hebraic in structure, and they were trying to translate it. They say, do you want us to put it into English before and then put it into Hebrew, or you just want to take us as is and get it into Hebrew? Because it isn't. And someone else mentioned how many Hebraisms there are in the Book of Mormon. And, like it came to pass. That's a really easy one. They don't have periods. But my Book of Mormon that I study from, it's just full of all of these Hebraisms, and it's just all the way through. And it just every time I read it, I just this is so fantastic that, and you don't. It's kind of like I liken it to these people who believe in evolution. It's like, okay, let's take an engine and totally disassemble it and throw it out on the mat and wait for it to assemble itself. It becomes that order of complexity. It just things like that complexity don't just happen. There is God is in the details. He's making it happen.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if when we think of chiasmus, I wonder if there's more frequency of chiasmus in the Hebrew than normal, than on average. But I do know it's in other languages and it's in English. I mean, it's out there.
Right,
But
yeah. Well, it's like I pointed out in this presentation. You got it in the Quran, you've got it in Ugaritic texts, and you've Kichi Maya. It's out there. It is a form that people have used, but it's Hebraic as well, and we don't notice it so much in our English translation of the Bible. If you go back to the Hebrew, you notice more of it. But again, if Joseph Smith, being the 23-year-old person with his extensive education, was writing this, I mean, apologies to Blair, but I don't think accidentally he would have come up with this. I don't, beyond his academic ability, beyond Sidney Rigdon's or anybody else who he hadn't met Sidney Rigdon yet, but let's pick on Oliver Cowdery, who was a school teacher. Well, school teacher does not equate to having advanced studies in linguistics. He taught him, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So
yeah,
I
without question, the Book of Mormon is inspired.
yeah.
That one, yeah, that's given to me. But thank you, Phil.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody right now trying to go through. If you do have something and you're not in the reactions, shout it out.
We've kind of gone over our hour, by the way.
Oh, that's not surprising.
That's a good thing.
Ron Smith, you got something?
Yeah, since there's nobody else, I just would like to share a little experience that my wife and I had. We were in Mexico and stopped at a place, and my wife was cramping, and she asked for a hot water bottle, and so I went to and I didn't. I took a little bit of Spanish when I was in when I was in seventh grade. through my sophomore year in high school, we lived in Weslaco, Texas, which was right on the border, and so we had Spanish every year, and I had kids that spoke Spanish, but in school they had to speak English because that was the rule, and anyway, so I didn't have a very good grasp of Spanish, but I asked the manager if I could have a hot water bottle, and he looked at me kind of funny, and he said yes. Well, no, he didn't understand what it was, so I thought, oh boy, I'm gonna have to translate hot water bottle. So I said una botella de agua caliente, a bottle of water hot, and he looked at me a little strange, but he said sure, and I started to follow him, and he says, no, I'll bring it to the room. So about 45 minutes later, he comes with a pitcher of tepid water that he's warmed up a little bit. I don't know if he thought we were going to drink tea or something. But anyway, I thanked him for it, and we laughed about it. And when we got back home, I asked the Spanish teacher, how do you say hot water bottle? And and she said, "Oh, it's una balsa de agua caliente. It's a bag of water hot rather than a bottle of water hot." And you remember that when Oliver Cowdery tried to translate, um, he was told that, well, you have to study it out in your mind and ask me if it's right. And the thing that stuck with me through all of this is, what if what, what was being seen was actually a literal translation of the words that were there, and if he wanted a hot water bottle, it would say a bag of water hot. And how do you translate that? Do you translate it as a bag of hot water hot, or do you say a hot water bottle? Do you put it into the English form, or do you keep it there? The other experience that I had was I got a Russian Book of Mormon, and I tried. I had 1 year of Russian, and I tried to go through and read from the Russian, and so above every word, I would look up the word, but I didn't know how to decline the nouns. In Russian, you decline the nouns as well as the verbs to tell what part of speech they are, and I didn't know how to decline the nouns, and so I was guessing at every step what the root might be, and then looking it up and trying to put it down. And sometimes I would get the whole thing, this whole verse, and it would make absolutely no sense. And so then I would get out the English Book of Mormon and look up and oh, that's what that's trying to say. Um, my feeling is that from the description that and from Oliver Cowdery's experience is that because we have so many things that have preserved Hebraisms and sophisticated forms, whether they're just Hebrew or not, but sophisticated language forms that aren't particularly English language features. I think Joseph was looking at a fairly literal translation of the words that he saw. But if you have a literal translation of words that are in some other language, you still have to come up with, you still have to decide how to write that down in English. And and I think there was a mix there because of Oliver Cowdery's experience that Joseph had to do. So that's the way that I've put those things together. So that's just my my 2 cents on how the translation occurred.
Definitely
Thank
agree
you.
with that. being a Russian speaker myself, I understand, and it's we had a bunch of hymns translated into English, and some of the Russian speakers, some of the Russian natives says, why are you getting this bad German? They were translated from German. You got these bad German hymns, translated into Russian. It's very, very hard to get a direct and meaningful translation. And like you say, you're reading in the Book of Mormon in Russian. There are sometimes when it will say something and you say, well, that's not what it means in English. And it doesn't mean that in English, but it means that if you're going for the meaning of the phrase, then it's correct.
Yeah, yeah,
But,
exactly.
Yeah. Ja знаю.
Я не знаю ничего.
Тоже.
Спасибо.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody. Anybody else with questions or comments or input?
Boyd's hand is up.
Oh, Boyd's hand's back up. Go ahead, Boyd.
Just a side thing, and I don't know how this goes, but the chiasmus kind of reminds me of a sonata form in music. There's like a balance and symmetry where you start off with one form and you're kind of ending with, with a closing form, but it changes in the middle. And it kind of reminds me of that. Like and I'm wondering if there might be some relationship, even though one's music and one's writing, one's language. But it seems like there's an order to it, kind of like what was brought up earlier. Any thoughts on that? That's kind of a wild thought.
English, we write in sonnets. That's kind of our form. Hebrew, kind of the chiasmic. Other cultures as well. And what is it that the Greeks use? Their form is word escapes me, but yeah,
It's all Greek
have
to
all
me.
these. Yeah, it's all Greek to me. We have all these forms that we kind of adopt as a culture, and in this I will agree with Blair that that we are orderly in our thinking, and there there's everything crosses over, everything mixes, but different disciplines do sprout up, and you can identify, okay, this is a sonnet form, this is a chiasmic form, whatever the Greeks, whatever. I wish I could remember that, but I can't remember what it is right now. But yeah, so we're in violent agreement.
Okay. Anybody else? It is after 9 o'clock. Not sure what time.
I'd like to share an example. When I first went to Germany, I'd had a year and a half of college German to prepare me. And that had been a good 10 years or more since I'd had that experience. After I got there, I went to the officers club and had a lunch, and I ordered iced tea. And the waiter looked at me and he says, iced tea, what is iced tea? And so I explained to him, you take a hot water and you make the tea and then you put ice in it. He shook his head, went back. He brought me a cup of hot tea and 2 ice cubes. That was what I communicated to him. You put ice in it.
I had the same problem in Russia one time. I wanted hot chocolate, right?
Yeah.
So I said, "Горячий chocolate," and so they brought me out this little thing of chocolate sauce, all heated up. I wanted hot chocolate. I didn't want chocolate sauce, but hot chocolate, горячий chocolate, meant exactly. I got exactly what I asked for. You kind of got exactly what you asked for. You dumb American.
Okay, Terry, go ahead. You're muted.
There we go. When
There
I
you
was on
go.
my mission in France, we were teaching an English class, and I used the sentence, he threw the ball to her. In English, that's a simple sentence, but in French, you write it 6 different ways than you do in English. So I'm sure that in Russian or Hebrew or whatever, it's not an easy thing making the language you don't know into English for the rest of us to read. So I applaud Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and everybody involved to do that. That's why it was brought to us by God rather than by Joseph himself or any helper he had.
Thank you, Terry. It was done by the Spirit and power of God. And explain it, we're just poking into the air.
That's a lesson. I agree.
Okay. Anybody else got your hands up? I'm not seeing anybody. Paul, did you have anything else you want to contribute? I'm glad you're back because you're
Well-
about ready to sing us out, and I was not going to do that.
Well, I'm glad to get back, and I called Jeannie Ryder, and she was allowing me to listen on her by the telephone on her television set. So, but we got blasted out by the storm here apparently, and
Oh.
so I've only been able to listen but not to participate otherwise. So yes, I would like to conclude with a little bit of a chiastic song. May the Lord bless you, may the Lord keep you, may the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord bless you, may the Lord keep you, may the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord hold you in his arms, may he protect you from all harms. May the Lord guard you from all your strife. May he bless you throughout your life. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. Good night.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Phil. It was very good presentation. And Regina, thank you for joining us as well. I hope your storm is about over.
We're kind of in the middle of it.